The Abolition of Man is perhaps Lewis's most significant statement on modern culture. How many of you have read before the Space Trilogy? Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and Hideous Strength? Any of you? Only one. Okay. Well, if you've read that Hideous Strength, which is the final book in the Space Trilogy, The Abolition of Man is the theory behind that book. It's the theory behind what Lewis suggests or prophesies, if you want. The mentality behind what the world is coming to. Keep in mind, he's writing that in the 40s or 50s. So, a long time ago. But it's already here, lock, stock, and barrel. Okay. So if we can find time to discuss it, I'd really like to. We'll just have to see. I'm probably going to gyp us a little bit on the Space Trilogy to try to keep it to 3 days. Mere Christianity, I want to keep to 3 days because I don't want it to get preachy, so to speak. Till We Have Faces will probably take 3 days. I personally think Till We Have Faces is the greatest thing Lewis ever wrote. I mean, just hands down. Because it really incorporates all of his thinking. Okay? It incorporates his rational, logical side, and it incorporates his romantic, fantastic, emotional side. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to it. But today and whatever the next day is, Tuesday, we're going to do as much of Screwtape as we can. Hopefully we'll get it all done. Some of you have, looks like, individual copies of Screwtape. Some of you did get the Lewis Signature Classics. I brought my large copy of the Signature Classics, so the pagination's a little bit different, so we'll go by letter numbers. But I want to begin with the preface. Excuse me. Where Lewis says, I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence which I now offer to the public fell into my hands. There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves, the devils, demons, are equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. Okay? The materialist who doesn't believe, the magician who thinks he or she can conjure or order or command. The sort of script which is used in this book can be very easily obtained by anyone who has once learned the knack. But ill-disposed or excitable people who might make a bad use of it shall not learn it from me. Readers are advised to remember the devil is a liar. Not everything that Screwtape says should be assumed to be true, even from his own angle. I've made no attempt to identify any of the human beings mentioned in the letters, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Now, a little background thing about this. Screwtape has at times been said to be Lewis's, the best thing he wrote. Even when Lewis was alive, and for example, in the 40s, people made that claim. Lewis hated Screwtape. He did not like this novel, okay? For the simple reason, he says in some of his letters, it was too easy to write. And he was asked, how did you do this? And he said, well, frankly, it's quite easy. All he had to do was let himself go. That is, to depict evil, Lewis said, is not hard at all. All you have to do is let yourself go. It's depicting the other side that's hard. Why?
Because you've got to sound heavenly, like every word's got to be heavenly. Whereas we're fallen, So it's easy for us.
Yeah,
Right.
because you have to be good. And it's a lot harder to be bad than it is good, okay? Which is part of Lewis and Charles Williams, you know, et cetera, critique of William Blake's comment that John Milton was secretly of the devil's party. Because if you've read Paradise Lost, who gets all the best lines and all the best speeches? Man, it is Satan. I mean, he'd get the Pope to sign up with them almost, okay, with the kinds of lines and speeches he has. You know, Blake just misunderstood the rhetorical device that possibly he misunderstood. Who might I say Blake misunderstood anything? Possibly misunderstood kind of the rhetorical devices behind Paradise Lost.
Nobody remembered what Clarice Starling says. We all remember Hannibal Lecter's lines.
Yeah.
He's fascinating and he's evil.
He's fascinating and he's evil. It's exactly right. Okay? So, turn to the first letter. And what I'm going to do is, we're not going to read these, obviously, letter by letter, because that'd be an entire semester. So instead, I'm just going to kind of highlight some passages in each letter, and we'll go on from there and discuss them. Okay? Obviously, the framework here is you have a senior demon writing to a junior demon, whom he refers to as his nephew, Uncle Screwtape, and nephew Wormwood. Okay? And the series of correspondence, or the correspondence, is regarding Wormwood's temptation of his patient, whoever his patient is. And bear in mind the literal meaning of that word patient. What does it mean to be patient? Tell a 5-year-old kid a week and a half before Christmas, big huge stack of presents under the tree, wait. Be patient. It means suffer. Okay? Comes from the Latin root for to suffer. So a patient is someone who is suffering. Healthy people don't go to the hospital. Sick people go to the hospital. Okay? Where they become patients. So, he's talking about his patient. And in that first paragraph, Screwtape says, I know what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. Now, what is Screwtape talking about there? When a thing was proved and when it was not. When a thing was, let's say, should I get into politics? When a thing was a fact and when it's not a fact. Well, how do you prove a fact?
Empirical evidence.
Evidence. Empirical evidence. How else? Something that universities don't teach much of anymore.
Reasoning.
Logic. Reasoning. Okay? They still connected, that is a few hundred years ago, they still connected thinking with doing. In other words, thinking was an active process. And were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. That is, if they had an argument, and the argument proved X to be true, then that X to be true could cause a change of behavior. Does that still hold true? Not really, or not as much as it did. Your man, your patient, has been accustomed ever since he was a boy to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as what? Academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless, forward-looking, backward-looking. There's your political reference. Okay? Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. What's jargon?
In this case, I believe he means meaningless language.
Okay, meaningless language. It's also, you know, the shorthand kind of language a specific group uses to communicate among itself. Okay? If you're not within that group, you don't understand it quite as well. But when other people begin to use that jargon, they use it not fully understanding it. So, don't waste time trying to make them think that materialism is true. No. Make them think it is strong or stark or courageous, that it's the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. Because what is he suggesting, Screwtape? What is Screwtape suggesting the patient wants to be? If it's the philosophy of the future, he wants to be cutting edge, avant-garde. He wants to be on the lead, as it were, not following. Okay? So then he starts to talk about why you don't want to get into an argument. And he says, argument moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. Well, how so? By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason. And once it is awake, who can foresee the results? Who can say where reason will take this individual? Now, what is Screwtape really getting at there? It's the difference between reason, or let's call it rationality, and unreason or irrationality. Why do you not want to get into this? He says if you get into argument, you awaken his reason. Well, what will the reason, if you accept the premises behind Lewis's line of argument, and you have to accept the premises in order for this to work, what will the reason, rationality, always attest to?
Truth.
Truth. What's the source of truth?
It's essentially God.
It's God, exactly. Reason, okay, Lewis will say, is the aspect or an aspect of God within the individual. So you wake that up and you immediately, you undercut, you being Wormwood, you undercut what we're trying to get at. So he says, even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, notice twisted. Because what can you do with logic? You can twist it. How do you twist it? A logical train of thought, and what do? You insert a few illogicalities. You insert a few untruths. And what happens to that train of thought? It becomes untrue. Keep in mind what the word true means. Upright. Straight. So if it's untrue, it deviates, it declines from that uprightness. Okay? You will find, if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and with of immediate sense of experiences. Notice, therefore, what he is suggesting you want to get your patient to attend to. How many of you at this very moment are thinking about something other than Screwtape letters? Even though I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about something else. Right? What he's saying.
I had lunch.
Exactly. I ate too much. He is saying, get him to think about his immediate sensory perceptions rather than universal things. Why not universal things?
You may stumble upon God out there.
Exactly. Your business is to affix his attention on the stream. Teach him to call it, whatever's happening around him, real life. And don't let him ask what he means by real. Because as soon as you ask, like the Velveteen Rabbit does, what is real, what happens? That kind of question starts getting down into the nitty-gritty of reality. Because what is real then implies, oh, well, there's an unreal. So what's the difference between the real and the unreal? Well, then you have to define what you mean by those. The true, the untrue? Do you mean the material and the immaterial? So they keep talking. He says, remember, he's not a pure spirit like you are. Never having been a human, you don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressure of the ordinary. Do you ever feel pressured by the ordinary, the everyday, the mundane, the day in and day out? That's what he means. All right? Go to the last paragraph. You begin to see the point? Thanks to processes which we set at work in them centuries ago, them, humans, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar while the familiar is before their eyes. Or put it this way, to believe in the unreal while the real is right in front of their eyes. Well, what might the real be? Your job? Debt? Your car? I got in my car, got in one of our cars today to come to work. I'm backing down our driveway. We got a long driveway, and I thought, as I almost got to them, dadgummit, I've got a flat tire. I get out and pass driver's side rear tire, pull back in. My wife had to take two of my kids to school so I could get here in time. Okay, that's focusing on the ordinary, the immediate, not thinking of what's beyond all that. Keep pressing on him the ordinariness of things. Don't attempt to use science. You guys were talking about that little evolution pamphlet thing. Don't attempt to use science as a defense against Christianity. Why? Because that will encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. Evolution. Okay? Atoms. When was the last time you touched an atom? When was the last time you saw an atom? Well, that then starts to make you question about what you see as opposed to what you know or believe, etc. Okay? Do remember you are there to fuddle him. To keep him from using his reason. Okay? Go on to number 2. Notice what's happened between 1 and 2. The patient has now become a Christian. Now, a lot of Christians would say, well, then the book should be over because that's it. I mean, once you're Christian, that's it. I mean, once saved, always saved, you can never be, okay? Look at paragraph 2. One of our great allies at present is the church itself. There's a famous icon in the Orthodox Church. I'll bring it to class one day, maybe on Thursday. And it's called the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is kind of based on a book written in the 6th century by a monk named St. John of the Ladder, who wrote the book called The Ladder of Divine Ascent. Well, the icon looks kind of like this, okay? And it's essentially, there's a cloud up here and like an image of Jesus or something with open arms accepting people. And then there's a ladder. It goes from down here to up here. And right here, there's this big, giant, open mouth with teeth, and it's the mouth of hell. And there are people making their way up this ladder. Okay? The only problem is, while there are some people making their way up, other people are falling off. Other people are being pulled off. And a lot of the people you see heading that way, having fallen off the ladder and such, are clerics, priests, bishops, etc. You know, there's like one guy up here because, you know, he's safe, he made it. And there's a couple others down here that are crawling. They're not, you know, climbing up on their feet and stuff.
So is it a battle to get? Is that what they're doing? Battling?
Well, it's kind of an iconographic representation of what it takes to get to heaven. And each of the demons, you know, are essentially temptations and such. And you have to overcome those. Okay? One of our great allies at present is the church. Don't misunderstand. It's not a good thing that he became a Christian. That's not what Screwtape is saying. I do not mean the church as we see her. We who? The demons. Where do the demons?
On earth.
Can we see them?
They exist on the spiritual
plane. Okay.
They appear to at least have some vision beyond the present moment.
Exactly. So he says, I do not mean the church as we see her spread out through all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with banners. So what church is he talking about? Is he talking about Middle Tennessee Baptist? St. Mark's, you know, Methodist? No. He's talking about called the church triumph. All the members of the church from the beginning of the church till the present time. Okay? The church eternal, in other words. He says, no. That's a spectacle which makes our boldest tempters uneasy. A little indication there is like, well, you got to be careful of that. No. Don't think of that. Here's what I want you to think about. You want him to think about his neighbors who are Christians. You want to lean pretty heavily on these neighbors. For example, when he's at church, make his mind flit to and fro between an expression like the body of Christ and the actual faces in the next pew. The body of Christ. You know, St. Paul, Corinthians, how we're all all Christians are members of the body of Christ. They all build up, you know, the body of Christ, etc., with Christ as their head. In other words, not one individual Christian is more important than another. Why? Because you need a little finger like you need a thumb, like you need a middle toe, like you need a, okay, all members. But he says, okay, that's all good in theory. The pew in front of them, or the person sitting next to them, smells. Get them to think body of Christ with you. I don't want to be part of that body. It matters very little, of course, what kind of people that next pew really contains. The person may be a great warrior. No. Your patient is a fool. Provided that any of those neighbors sing out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or double chins, or odd clothes, the patient will quite easily believe that their religion must therefore be somehow ridiculous. And what does his patient therefore become? If I'm assuming, for the sake of argument, Paul is the next member in the pew, that he and I are sitting next to each other, and I look at Paul and I think, oh, well, he's an idiot. What have I just done? Okay. I've judged him. I've put myself above and him below. Keep everything hazy in his mind now, and you will have all eternity wherein to amuse yourself. Work hard then on the disappointment or anticlimax, which is certainly coming to the patient during his first few weeks as a churchman. And this applies to whether it's a church or not. Have you ever joined a group been asked to join a group and it's something maybe you've wanted to, and you join it and you kind of find out, well, this kind of sucks. That's what he's talking about. Yeah, he's full of the quote-unquote fervor of faith at this moment. But let him keep going to church and keep seeing the kind of people around him at church, and that fervor will die out. Okay? And then Screwtape goes on and talks about what the enemy allows us to do. Now, who is the enemy from Screwtape's perspective? God. Okay? The enemy allows this disappointment to occur on the threshold of every human endeavor. What does that mean?
Life is hard, take advantage of it.
Okay.
That is to say, life is never as easy as people would like it to be, and whenever you try to accomplish something, it's always going to be a little bit harder than you thought it was.
Okay.
Without those hardships, there's not those glories.
Without those hardships, you lack the glories. It's like back when I was running marathons, when I'd start to train for, a marathon, if I hadn't kept up my running, it'd be hard to make the break from 6-7 miles to 10 to 15 miles, or from 10 or 15 miles to 20 miles. Okay? But when I would start training, I'd be full of, this is what I want to do, here's my goal pace, blah, 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 blah. And usually 2 or 3 weeks in, there'd be a bit of a crash. That's what he's talking about. Okay? But he says, the enemy allows this disappointment. Why? Well, it occurs, this kind of disappointment, for example, when lovers have got married and begin the real task of learning to live together. In every department of life, it marks the transition from dreaming aspiration to laborious doing. If any of you are going to plan on going on to be a graduate student or to teach at a university, this is what graduate students really face at thesis or dissertation time. They've gotten the coursework out of the way, and now all they've got to do is write their master's thesis or dissertation. And then they realize, this isn't fun anymore. This is just no fun. What I do not like being a student. And I hate you as my dissertation director. We used to get along so great. I hate your guts. I don't want to hear your voice. I don't want to see your face. Okay? The enemy takes this risk because he has a curious fantasy of making all these disgusting little human vermin, sounds like Megatron, into what he calls his free lovers and servants. Sons is the word he uses. With his inveterate love of degrading the whole spiritual world by unnatural liaisons with these two-legged animals. Desiring their freedom, he therefore refuses to carry them. Carry them how?
It gets control of them.
Okay. How else?
Carry them through those hard endeavors.
This is where Lewis would say, that stupid little footprints in the sand poem. Life was gone, it was really hard, and where were you, God? Well, I was carrying you, is what Lewis would say. He refuses to carry them by their mere affections and habits to any of the goals which he sets before them. He leaves them to do it on their own. Right? Like writing a paper. Speaking of which, hand them to the middle. Like writing a paper. Okay? He leaves them to do it on their own. They have to produce. Thank you. And therein lies our opportunity. But there lies also our danger. If once they get through this initial dryness successfully, they become much less dependent on emotion and therefore much harder to tempt. Why do they become less dependent on emotion?
because they have their own experience to rely on.
Actual doing.
They actually did it. Okay, what did he say earlier? You get that train of argument, and they realized a few hundred years ago that thoughts led to actions. Okay? So they actually did something. Yet what happened, if any of you understand what Screwtape is talking about here, what happened when you started something new and you got those disillusioning thoughts? If you kept going, disillusioning emotions, you overcame them. And what happens once you overcame them and you achieved whatever it was you set out for yourself? You realized, well, that would have been stupid to stop. Okay? And it wasn't really rational to stop. It was what? It was your emotions telling you, this doesn't feel good, to stop. Okay? Letter 3. Okay? Now notice what he gets to. Okay, he talked about ordinariness. He talked about everyday life. Let's talk about your parents. I like what you tell me about this man's mother, but work on him. Keep his mind on the inner life. Why? Because he thinks his conversion is something inside him. He thinks his conversion happened in here. And that therefore it doesn't have any effect where? Out here. Okay? Keep his mind off the most elementary duties by directing it to the most advanced and spiritual ones. What does that mean? The most elementary duties.
Simple stuff.
Such as, give me a concrete example.
Brushing your teeth.
Brushing your teeth. Okay.
Putting someone else in front of you, or doing something for someone else.
How about opening a door? Letting somebody have that parking spot. Letting somebody merge onto the highway without giving them the single finger salute. Okay? Those are all very simple things, right? So what are the most advanced and spiritual things that you want to get your patient to think about?
Theological argument.
Theological argument? What else?
Like interpretation or translation or something like that.
Interpretation or translation? How about developing this great interior prayer life? You know, where you're going to pray several times a day, or you're going to memorize the Psalms, so that you set yourself, well, I'm a Christian, I want to do blah, 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 and so I've got to do, what? I've got to mimic, I've got to put on my little what would Jesus do button and mimic Jesus out in the wilderness, fasting for 40 days and nights. That's a spiritual exercise. And get him to think about that rather than when he drives down the road and he sees some homeless guy with a sign, stopping and giving him a few bucks.
And the people behind you honking.
Yeah, people behind you honking. So you turn around while you give them money, you flip them off and use a few choice words, the great karma battle,
You were doing so.
So, it is no doubt, he says, impossible to prevent his praying for his mother. But we can make those prayers innocuous. How? Make sure they're always very spiritual, that he's concerned with the state of her soul, and never with her rheumatism. What does that mean, and never with her rheumatism?
Physical aspects going over and helping her out.
Bingo!
What she might be experiencing.
It's not the
Okay.
particulars that he's concerned himself with.
So, pray for her eternal salvation, but don't get up and get her a hot water bottle to ease her physical pain at that particular moment. Pray for the guy that you see homeless on the side of the road, drive down, oh Lord, please provide him food, and just keep cruising on by. Rather than, okay, in the first place, if you do this, the kind of thing, he says, two things will happen. One, his attention will be kept on what? Her sins. Because if he's praying for her soul, what does he assume about her soul? kind of shaking.
Needs help.
Yeah, it needs help. Okay? And by doing that, you can also get him to think about praying for her behavior, her actions. And in doing so, you get him to focus on her actions that are inconvenient or irritating to himself. Lord, help her to not smack her lips when she eats. What does that do? That makes him think about the next time when they eat, she's going to sit there and go, and it's going to drive him crazy. So he's going to have to pray more about it, which is going to drive me more crazy when he goes and, right? Screwtape's a pretty smart dude. When two humans, next paragraph, have lived together for many years, it usually happens that each has tones of voice and expressions of face which are almost unendurably irritating to the other. Anybody, can say amen to that? Okay? Work on that. Notice work on that doesn't mean help him to not pay any attention to that. It means stoke that fire so that whatever she does that is irritating, it just irritates him more. Bring fully into the consciousness of your patient that particular lift of his mother's eyebrows, which he learned to dislike in the nursery. All those individual little things, he says, make that even more annoying to him. Okay? And then he asks, tell me about the old lady's religious position, etc. Okay, go on to letter 4. The amateur is really unfortunate. It also reveals an unpleasant desire to shift responsibility. You must learn to pay for your own blunders. In other words, he is saying that Wormwood wrote and said, well, your encouragement of me to minimize, his prayers about his mother didn't work. He's praying for her. No, you can't blame me on that. What is Screwtape actually doing with that statement? He's covering his own backside. Okay.
He's calling rank on him.
He's definitely pulling rank on him. So he says the best thing, of course, is to keep the patient from the serious intention of praying altogether. All right? Skipping a few lines. He says, here's what you want to do. Make him think that his prayers are like the parrot-like nature of his prayers in childhood. In reaction against that, he may be persuaded to aim at something entirely spontaneous, inward, informal, unregularized. And what this will actually mean to a beginner will be an effort to produce in himself a vaguely devotional mood in which real concentration of will intelligence have no part. In other words, get him to feel religious when he's praying. Coleridge, for example, did not pray with moving lips and bended knees, but merely composed his spirit to love and indulged a sense of supplication. Now, what the blank does that mean? Okay? He composed his spirit to love. To love what? The tree? He's a romantic. The flower? The bird? No. And indulged a sense of supplication. This is the kind of prayer we want. Notice, what does the prayer not include?
Actual praying.
Meaning what?
Words. He doesn't actually say anything. He
Words?
just kind of kneels down and closes his eyes and goes, I'm praying.
He doesn't say anything. Is there a direction? Is there a person it's aimed at? Or no. What is it all about? Ooh, I feel warm and fuzzy. This must be prayer. Okay? They, that is us, constantly forget what you, Screwtape and Wormwood, must always remember. They are animals, and that whatever their bodies do affects their souls. Bodies affect souls. Okay? Mortals picture us as putting things into their minds, he says. He said, in reality, our best work is keeping things out of their minds. So, when they are attending to the enemy, we are defeated. In other words, when they are really praying, we are defeated. But there are ways of preventing them from doing so. Turn their gaze away from him and towards themselves. Okay. Turn their gaze away from God and inward. Again, making them think, make us think about our prayers, about the quality of our prayers. Are our prayers sincere? Are they our own? Are they real? All that kind of stuff. Teach them to estimate the value of each prayer by their success in producing the desired feeling. Remember that great scene in Hamlet? Hamlet finds Claudius praying. Claudius is on his knees. He's holding his sword. He's praying to God. He says, I'm guilty. I've killed my brother. I've slept with his wife. Blah, 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 blah. And Hamlet thinks, well, I can't kill him now. If I kill him now, he goes straight to heaven. I'm going to catch him when he's in bed. And so he leaves. And then Claudius says, thoughts to heaven go. No, words to heaven go while thoughts remain below. Saying he wasn't sincere. Okay? Never let them suspect how much success or failure of that kind depends on whether they are well or ill, fresh or tired at the moment. In other words, success or failure and how one feels about prayer is entirely dependent upon the state of your physical body. That's why he said earlier, the body affects the soul. If you're tired, it's kind of harder to produce that feeling, isn't it? I mean, how many of you come to class, whatever class, if you've had a really horrible day or week or month or life, and you just, come in like, don't get started, Sherman. Don't screw with me today because I'm really... Happens at this side too, right? Depending on whether or not they feel ill or well, hungry or full, tired or well rested. And then he says, the enemy, however, will not be idle. Wherever there is prayer, there is danger of his own immediate action. He is cynically indifferent to the dignity of his position, and ours as pure spirits, and to human animals on their knees, he pours out self-knowledge in a quite shameless fashion. In other words, Screwtape is saying, God doesn't care whether or not he's addressed properly. O great and mighty, all-merciful King and Lord, creator of the universe, only self-existing one, blah, 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 blah. Help. Doesn't matter, he's saying. No. What does he do? Even if he defeats your first attempt at misdirection, we have a subtler weapon. The humans do not start from that direct perception of him, which we, unhappily, cannot avoid. What's that direct perception he's talking about?
They've seen God.
Yeah. He says, humans don't have, well, maybe except with few exceptions, don't have that perception of God. Listen how he describes it. They've never known that ghastly luminosity, that stabbing and searing glare which makes the background of permanent pain to our lives. If you look into your patient's mind when he is praying, you will not find that. Okay? Why? Or let me rephrase it. Why doesn't God give that illumination or that perception?
It wouldn't be all that fun to serve somebody who was just glaring at you all the time.
Okay. Why else?
Because he gives free will.
Free will.
There's a whole perception of
like flawed human, fallen human, not being able to perceive
Okay,
God, and that it would actually destroy them.
okay.
God requires faith, not fact.
God imparts faith, not fact. God tells Moses, no man can see my face and live. Okay, but you can see my backside, etc.
My grandmother had a cousin who saw the back of God's head.
William Blake says he saw God's forehead on his window pane one Christmas. But that's William Blake for you. I mean, it's kind of out there. Okay? If you examine the object to which he is attending, that is, to which your patient is attending while he's praying, you will find that it is a composite object containing many quite ridiculous ingredients. That is, when he's thinking about praying, if he creates an image in his mind, he says it's a composite image. It's an image made up of a whole bunch of different images, and it's quite ridiculous. So get him to focus on that. What don't you want him to focus on? The real God. Right? Whatever the nature of that composite object, you must keep him praying to it, to the thing that he has made, not to the person who has made him. Okay? Skipping several more lines. Once all his thoughts and images have been flung aside, or if retained with a full recognition of their merely subjective nature, and the man trusts himself to the completely real, external, invisible presence, there with him in the room and never knowable by him as he is known by it, why then it is that the incalculable may occur. That is, once the thoughts and images your patient has created for himself about who or what it is he's praying to, once those have been flung aside, or even retained with the knowledge that they're mere images he has created, Screwtape is saying, watch out, man, because you don't know what can happen next. That's what he means by the incalculable may occur. To use language of the fairy story essay, joy might break through and show himself. Okay? Here's an example. Everybody remember who Mother Teresa was? Okay? Died in 97. When she was a young lady, a young nun, this was in the 1940s. I think it was about 1947, in fact. She was on a train, and she had a quote-unquote an experience of God. Christ appeared to her and told her to go to Calcutta and take care of the worst of the worst. Okay? Very moving experience. She went to her bishop. Her bishop said, okay. She goes off to Calcutta. She founds the Order of the Sisters of Mercy, or whatever it's called, and then lives the next 50 years in Calcutta treating the undesirables, the people that most Indians would have nothing to do with. Over the years, she wrote to her father confessor a series of letters, okay, in which she lamented that from that train ride in, I think it was 1947, until the last of these letters, she had never had another single experience like that. In fact, what she says in these letters, because somebody got hold of them and actually published them, even though she requested that everything that she had written privately be burned. What she said in these letters was that from that moment on, she felt like God had turned his back on her and had never heard her prayers. Okay? For 50 years. And then she dies. Now, keep in mind what he said earlier. You get that full fervor of faith, and then God pulls away, and you get this dry period. That's a 50-year dry period. Okay? But, he says, once they get that notion that they've created in their minds out, the incalculable can occur. Turn to Yeah, turn to number 5. Go to the last page of it. It's the second to the last paragraph. It's right about in the middle of the second to last paragraph. It's actually the second paragraph in the letter. There's only 3. It's the long one. Begin with the sentence, I know that the enemy disapproves many of these causes. That is, the causes that people find themselves involved in. Okay, they're talking about the war. But that is where he is so unfair. Now, what are the causes he's talking about? I think Lewis is talking about causes like causes against Jews. You know, Hitler's persecution of Jews and gays and Catholics and other Christians. Okay? And gypsies. And people with any kind of birth defects. I mean, he was after all of them. Okay? I know that the enemy disapproves many of these causes. In other words, God isn't a Nazi. Okay? But that is where he's so unfair. He often makes prizes of humans who have given their lives for causes he thinks bad. That is, for causes he disagrees with. On the monstrously sophistical ground that the humans thought them good and were following the best they knew. What in the hell is he talking about? Is he saying that God had prizes of humans among the Nazis? How many of you have read The Last Battle? Final book in the Chronicles of Narnia. A couple of you have. A few of you have. Do you remember what happens to the character named Emmett? E-M-E-T-H. He's a knight of Tash. Okay. He's a servant of Tash, the god who is against Aslan in Narnia. Okay. He's kind of a demonic spirit kind of a thing. Well, when Emmett goes into the stable at the end of, or beginning of line which, Last Battle, he goes in and he doesn't find himself in a stable. He finds himself out on a meadow. Beautiful trees and sun and everything. And he meets up with Aslan, the lion, the son of the emperor over the sea and everything. And he's like, what gives? I don't understand this. I denied you all my life. I served Tash all my life. And Aslan says, yes, you did. I took your service to Tash as being to me. You just didn't know any better. Now, if you take that statement and this statement together, what does Lewis seem to be suggesting?
Religious devotion is rewarded.
Not all those who say, Lord, Lord, Matthew 25, will find their way into heaven. Similarly, not all those who don't say, Lord, Lord, will end up in hell. He seems to be suggesting that one can end up in heaven and not have been a Christian. Okay? And he seems to be saying that one can end up in hell and have been a Christian. Now go to number 6. I'm trying to get as many of these done as we can. We're not going to do Screwtape proposes a toast. Okay, so number 6. Talking about the patient and second paragraph. Your patient will, of course, have picked up the notion that he must submit with patience to the enemy's will. He must submit with patience, there's that word again, with suffering to the enemy's will. What the enemy means by this is primarily that he should accept with patience the tribulation which has actually been dealt out to him, the present anxiety and suspense. Now notice what Screwtape is saying. What does the patient not need to do? This is something a lot of Christians today think they do need to do. The patient doesn't need to go out and look for problems, look for troubles to endure. He doesn't need to go out and find something to patiently endure. What does he need to do? He needs to patiently endure what comes to him. Okay, let's come down to brass tacks. What does that mean for you? It means you have got to patiently endure another 25 minutes of this class. And then if you have any other classes, it means you have to endure that. Or if you have to go home and then go to work, it means you have to patiently endure that. Okay? Or maybe you'll get a flat tire on your way home. Sorry. Okay?
Don't jinx it, please.
Knock on wood, of course it's not wood. It means that. To patiently endure the things that happen in your own daily existence. Okay? It is about this. Okay? These ordinary, average, everyday occurrences that he is to say, thy will be done. He's not saying, oh, the great, cosmic battles of the world. He's not saying, I've got to go out and find a cure for poverty. And that's the way thy will be. No. What does it mean? It means somebody sitting next to you in class is hungry and you've got a little bit more, giving them something. Okay? And for the daily task of bearing this, bearing what? That God's will be done. That the daily bread will be provided. In other words, the daily bread is meant to be the bread that enables you to get through the day. Just like the bread that the Israelites got from heaven in the Exodus. How long did that bread last, that manna from heaven? One day. What happened when they tried to keep it till the next day? It wasn't any good. It had worms in it. Okay? It is your business, that is you, the tempter, the demon, it's your business to see that the patient never thinks of the present fear as his appointed cross. He who would follow me must what? Take up his cross and deny himself. Okay, so what's the present fear? What did I get on my midterm exam? That's the present fear. Okay? Your idea, he says, is to get the patient to see that he never thinks of his present fear as his appointed cross, but only of the things he is afraid of. So what are the things you are afraid of that don't have to do with this paper? Losing your job? Getting a flat tire on the way home from school or work? There, I mentioned it twice. All it takes is a third time and you're all goners. It's getting him to think of those bigger things and not the immediate things. All right? Go to the next paragraph. An important spiritual law is here involved. I've explained to you that you weaken his prayers by diverting his attention from the enemy himself to his own states of mind about the enemy. On the other hand, fear becomes easier to master when the patient's mind is diverted from the thing feared to the fear itself. Like FDR's. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Okay? Or, J.K. Rowling's in the Harry Potter stuff, what Dumbledore says about using Voldemort's name, because he says the fear of the name of a thing increases the fear of the thing itself. So people don't call him Voldemort. They call him he who must not be named and make him even more fearsome than he is. All right? Fear becomes easier to master when the patient's mind is diverted from the thing feared to the fear itself, considered as a present and undesirable state of his own mind. When he regards the fear as his appointed cross, he will inevitably, think of it as a state of mind. One can therefore formulate the general rule. In all activities of mind which favor our cause, that is the cause of the tempters, encourage the patient to be unself-conscious and to concentrate on the object. But in all activities favorable to the enemy, bend his mind back on itself. So, anything that has to do with us, what? Get him to think not of himself, but of other things. Anything that has to do with the enemy, get him not to think of the enemy, but himself. Let an insult or a woman's body so fix his attention outward that he does not reflect, I am now entering into the state called anger, or the state called lust. All right? I don't want to skip the stuff about war. One to the next paragraph after that. Do what you will, there's going to be some benevolence as well as some malice in your patient's soul. There's going to be some good there. The great thing is to direct the malice to his immediate neighbors whom he meets every day, and to thrust his benevolence out to the remote circumference, to people he does not know. Like, you're sitting there, you're watching TV, you're minding your own business, and on comes this commercial for feeding starving children in Ethiopia. And you see these children with these bloated bellies and flies all over and stuff. And what does it do? It makes you feel guilty. So, to ease your Western American guilt, pull out the credit card, call the number, give a donation, and wipe the slate clean. Because that then makes you think, oh, I've done a good deed. I've helped feed the poor. Screw the person down below me on the street. He's just a no-good layabout who won't get a job. Or she's a welfare mom, or pick your, political phrase, so to speak. Okay? So, get him not to think good things about the person immediately in his vicinity. Get him to think bad things. And get him to think good things about those he really will have no contact with. Letter 7. This is an interesting one. Should we get your patient to know about our existence? Our policy for the moment is to conceal ourselves. Of course, this has not always been so. We are really faced with a cruel dilemma. When the humans disbelieve in our existence, we lose all the pleasing results of direct terrorism, and we make no magicians. Okay? If they disbelieve in our existence, then all the Freddy Krueger movies, all the horror movies really completely lose all impact. The Exorcist, loses all impact. Because if you really, truly disbelieve in their existence, then it's nothing but special effects. If, however, you believe in that existence, and you kind of go, ooh, that's too close, or that's, gives me the willies or whatever, then that creates a different problem. So he says, on the other hand, when they believe in us, we cannot make them materialists and skeptics. Materialists, believers in only what they see. And skeptics, doubters. Skeptics doesn't just mean skeptics of our existence. What does it mean? You'll see a bumper sticker all over campus that says, question authority. That's skeptic. Question authority. It really means doubt all authority. What's another way of putting that? Trust no one. Trust no one. So, if they are made to know of our existence, then we can't make them skeptics anymore. We can't make them materialists, because they'll see there's something more than materiality. So, I have great hopes that we shall learn in due time how to emotionalize and mythologize their science to such an extent that what is in effect a belief in us, though not under that name, will creep in while the human mind remains closed to belief in the enemy. Now, that is the kernel of truth, or the germ, or the seed, out of which that hideous strength grows. To get to this scientific thought, this scientific mentality that says there are existences beyond what we can see. There are powers, there are intelligences beyond what we can see that we can somehow tap into and control on one hand, yet there is no God. In other words, it's an acceptance of one half of, let's call, supernatural reality, and completely discarding the other half, but saying, well, we can control this. Okay?
People do that with angels and demons all the time. They'll believe in one or not the other.
Oh, sure.
Hell, but no angels.
Or heaven, but no hell, kind of a thing. So he says the life force, the worship of sex, and some aspects of psychoanalysis may here prove useful. If once we can produce our perfect work, the materialist magician, the person who says only that which can be empirically proven, and yet who wants to control through means of some kind of immaterial power. The man not using but veritably worshiping what he vaguely calls forces while denying the existence of spirits. Then the end of the war will be in sight. All right? Go to the next letter. Like I said, I'm trying to get through this fast. Look at the second paragraph. Probably haven't thought about yourself this way. Humans are amphibians. Half spirit, half animal. Okay? The enemy's determination to produce such a revolting hybrid was one of the things that determined our Father to withdraw his support from the enemy. As spirits, they belong to the eternal world, but as animals, they inhabit time. This means that while their spirit can be directed to an eternal object, the body's passions and imaginations are in continual change. For in time means to change. So, hope and change really means nothing more than hope and time. Because to be in time, Screwtape is saying, means simply to be in change. Okay. The nearest approach to constancy, to permanence, to unchangeableness, they say, is undulation. The repeated return to a level from which they repeatedly fall back. A series of troughs and peaks. How many of you have that as your existence? I mean, do you reach highs and you're up there for a while and then you kind of slough back down and then you go back up and then you go back down and then you go back up and you go back. It's the middle of the semester, so you're probably kind of down here about now. You might get up and then at the end of the semester, and then when it's over, you're going to be way up there. So he says, as long as he lives on earth, periods of emotional and bodily richness and liveliness will alternate with periods of numbness and poverty. Poverty, he doesn't mean material poverty. He just means poorness of spirit, dryness, depression. Notice, Screwtape is saying that's an aspect of life. Up and down, up and down, up and down. And yet we ask, why can't it all be up? Well, why can't you stay excited all the time? You get all that adrenaline flowing and then you crash.
There's your body there affecting your...
Exactly. There's your body affecting your spirit. So, skip down to the next paragraph. It may surprise you to learn that in his efforts to get permanent possession of a soul, he, that is the enemy, relies on the troughs even more than on the peaks. God, Screwtape says, relies more on the valleys of human experience. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Okay, Psalm 23. God relies more on the valleys than on the peaks. And yet, a lot of people today seem to have that completely the other way around. And it's on the peaks when we're at our best, or closest to God, so to speak. Some of his special favorites have gone through longer and deeper troughs than anyone else. Witness, Mother Teresa. Okay, there's another book from the Middle Ages, Teresa of Avila, I think it is, Dark Night of the Soul. Okay, same kind of thing. The reason is this: to us, I love this line, a human is primarily food. Our aim is the absorption of its will into ours, the increase of our own area of selfhood at its expense. But the obedience which the enemy demands of man is quite a different thing. One must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. Okay, now, Screwtape is writing this to his nephew. He's saying, yeah, I know what you've heard. It's not propaganda. It's truth. Well, what does that mean? He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself. Creatures whose life on its miniature scale will be qualitatively like his own. Absorb them, but because their wills freely conform to his. St. Peter writes in 2 Peter, know you not that ye are partakers of God? Okay? And what he means by that is you are meant to become like God. Not you're meant to become God, you're meant to become like God through adoption and such. He, God, we want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in. He wants to give out. We are empty and would be filled. He is full and flows over. Our war aim is a world in which our Father below has drawn all other things into himself. An image of Satan there is the great black hole, as it were. The enemy wants a world full of beings united to him, but still distinct. So that you have a whole bunch of, I'll use language from one of the books in the Space Trilogy, a whole bunch of little malodills running around. Okay? Where'd that go? Make sure it's still recording. You see now that the irresistible and the indisputable are the two weapons which the very nature of his scheme forbids him to use. The irresistible. What does that mean? God presenting himself in such a way that we would have no choice but to follow. Okay? The indisputable. What does that literally mean? Logically, you cannot argue with it. This would be, you point the Hubble telescope to some place out in space, one of the 800 or so planets that's been found, and you kick up the resolution on it, and you see written out there on this big giant planet, God exists. That would kind of be indisputable. You couldn't argue with that. Okay? The irresistible. You can't help but be drawn by it. So what does he mean? Merely to override a human will, as his felt presence in any but the faintest and most mitigated degree would certainly do, would be for him useless. In other words, it wouldn't work for God to suddenly manifest himself right here in our presence. Not only because it would kill us, but because what would it do? It would be like an imperious curse. It would take away our will. It would take away choice. Right? Now, this is pretty important stuff because this is going to come up again until we have faces. The last book we're going to read. Because this is an issue, I think, Lewis kind of wrestled with. I mean, yeah, he puts it all here in good logical fashion. But there's a very logical Lewis and then there's a not as logical Lewis. Okay? Later on. He cannot ravish, he can only woo. Ravish. What does that mean? It's rape. He can't rape us. He can't take away our wills. He can only do what? Send cards, buy flowers, get candy. All those little clues for his ignoble idea is to eat the cake and have it. The creatures are to be one with him, but yet themselves. Okay? So what happens? Yes, he might give little indications of his presence. And then what? He never allows this state of affairs to last long. What does he do? Sooner or later, he withdraws. If not, in fact, at least from the conscious experience, all those supports and incentives. All the good things you might have felt when you began something, they gradually get pulled back. He leaves the creature to stand up on its own legs, to carry out from the will alone duties which have lost all relish, like reading for an exam. Most of you are English majors, or many of you are English majors, probably because for whatever reason, you like to read. If anything can kill the desire to read, it's becoming an English major. Okay? Happens all the time. It is during such trough periods, much more than during the peak periods, that that is the individual, is growing into the sort of creature he wants it to be. Hence, the prayers offered in the state of dryness are those which please him best. Read the Psalms. What are the most powerful Psalms? The ones when life is really bad for David. I mean, really bad. Okay? He wants them to learn to walk and must therefore take away his hand. Guess what? Just like a parent with a child. What does every child have to do to learn to walk? Fall flat on their face. What does every child have to do to learn how to ride a bicycle? You got to take the stupid training wheels off at some point, unless you're going to raise an emotional cripple. Okay? That's how it is. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks around upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. And there's Mother Teresa again. I mean, you would think after you're 20, after you're 30, after you're 40, throw our hands up in despair and say, that's it, I give. What good? But she kept on going. Even though she felt like God was not hearing her prayers, was not listening to her, had nothing to do with her. Okay? All right, we're going to stop there. I do want to make one comment, though. As you think about papers,